out, but Captain Traore and Burkina Faso, as they know that both, whether it's their gold reserves, that is all those proceeds are just in exchange to protect the junta regime. There's a number of examples across. Even in Sudan, what's going on with the rapid support forces and Burhan of the Sudan forces, when you get down to it, is all about the revenue that can be drawn out of that. And there are nefarious actors in the CCP and sometimes Russia are complicit in those activities.
Okay, well, you can't imagine how frustrating it seems to me that this...
Imagine you're sitting at home, peacefully enjoying dinner with your family. Suddenly there's a loud knock at the door. You open it to find your neighbour standing there with a stern expression. "I've been watching how you raise your children," your neighbour announces. "And I think you're making terrible choices. Your parenting style is harming them. You should follow my advice instead because I know what's best for your family." How would you feel? Angry? Insulted? Would you tell this neighbour to mind their own business? This awkward scenario might seem far-fetched, but something remarkably similar is happening on the world stage. Instead of a nosy neighbour, it's powerful countries telling smaller nations how to run their affairs. Instead of parenting advice, it's criticism about international partnerships and policy decisions. This is the story of Burkina Faso, a West African nation standing up against foreign powers, trying to dictate its choices. It's a tale of sovereignty, dignity, and the right of a nation to chart its own course, even when global superpowers disapprove. But what gives countries like the United States the confidence to judge others? Why do they feel entitled to determine which partnerships are appropriate for nations like Burkina Faso? And most importantly, what happens when a country like Burkina Faso decides to say thanks but no thanks to this unsolicited guidance? The answers reveal a fascinating struggle between global superpowers and nations determined to forge their own destinies. Let's dive into this compelling story. The diplomatic world erupted with tension recently when Burkina Faso's government condemned remarks made by a high-ranking US military official. General Michael Langley, commander of the United States Africa Command, had made comments suggesting Burkina Faso's partnerships with Russia and China were harmful to its citizens. During a US Senate hearing on April 3rd, General Langley questioned the West African nation's foreign policy decisions. He implied that Burkina Faso's leaders were making choices that weren't serving the best interests of its people. Burkina Faso's response was swift and firm. The Burkinabe Ministry of Foreign Affairs released a strongly worded statement describing General Langley's remarks as unjustified and politically biased. The government rejected the notion that outsiders could better determine what was good for Burkinabe people than their own elected leaders. This clash of perspectives raises profound questions about international relations. Does any nation, regardless of its power or influence, have the right to judge another country's partnerships? Should global superpowers have a say in which alliances smaller nations form? But why does the US always poke its nose into the affairs of other countries? To understand this conflict fully, we need to step back and look at the bigger picture of what's happening in Burkina Faso and why its choices matter on the world stage. At the centre of this story stands an unusual leader, Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso's president. What makes Traoré remarkable isn't just his policies, but a decision that captured global attention. He refused to accept his presidential salary. "Pay me as a captain," Traoré reportedly said, referring to his military rank before becoming president. Instead of pocketing his presidential wages, he directed that money toward a national fund. He encouraged other officials to contribute portions of their salaries as well, creating a pool of resources that wouldn't come with strings attached from foreign donors. This fund serves multiple purposes: purchasing weapons to fight terrorism, building infrastructure, supporting education, and developing national industries. Traoré's vision was clear: reduce dependence on Western nations and international financial institutions like the World Bank, create self-sufficiency rather than perpetuate cycles of debt and dependency. "We don't want to be beggars," reflects the sentiment behind this approach. By generating resources internally, Burkina Faso could make decisions based on its own priorities rather than conditions attached to foreign aid. This independent stance extends beyond financial matters to the country's diplomatic relationships. After years of partnership with Western nations, particularly France, its former colonial ruler, Burkina Faso, has pivoted toward relationships with Russia and China. This shift is what prompted General Langley's controversial comments. But why would Burkina Faso move away from traditional Western partnerships? What led to this significant change in foreign policy? The answers lie in the country's complex history and current challenges. To understand Burkina Faso's current position, we must look back at its history. Like many African nations, Burkina Faso spent decades under European colonial rule. France controlled the territory, then called Upper Volta, until independence in 1960. However, formal independence didn't immediately translate to genuine autonomy. Economic ties, military agreements, and political influence ensured that France maintained significant control over its former colony. This pattern, sometimes called neo-colonialism, kept many African nations functionally dependent on former colonizers despite their nominal independence. For decades, France maintained a military presence in Burkina Faso, ostensibly to help combat terrorism in the Sahel region. But questions about effectiveness and true motives grew louder. If the goal was to defeat terrorist groups, why did the security situation continue to deteriorate despite years of French military involvement? This growing skepticism set the stage for change. In recent years, Burkina Faso decided it wanted a different approach, one where it controlled its own security destiny rather than relying on former colonial powers. "We can deal with this ourselves," became the rallying cry. The government expelled French forces and began seeking alternative partnerships, including with Russia and China. This shift represents more than just changing military allies. It symbolizes a deeper quest for true independence, not just political independence on paper, but genuine economic, military, and diplomatic autonomy. But any nation making such a dramatic pivot should expect pushback from the powers losing influence. And pushback came, though perhaps not in the form Burkina Faso expected. If this story has stirred something in you, even just a little, then don't scroll past without doing your part. Hit that like button to show you're not one of the silent ones. Subscribe to The New Tourist if you believe these truths deserve to be heard, not buried. And don't keep this to yourself. Share this video with someone who still thinks they understand Africa. Because if we stay quiet, we're no better than those who stood by and watched history burn. We're no better than those African leaders, cowards who were silent, while their citizens flee their homeland for the so-called American dream. To grasp what's happening in Burkina Faso, we need to zoom out and see the global context. Africa has become a crucial arena in what many analysts call a new Cold War. Not between the United States and the Soviet Union this time, but between the US, China, and Russia. These global powers are vying for influence across the African continent. Each offers different types of partnerships. The United States and European nations typically emphasize democracy, human rights and market reforms, along with their aid packages and military cooperation. These partnerships often come with political conditions. China focuses on massive infrastructure projects through its Belt and Road Initiative, offering loans and construction expertise without the political requirements that Western nations impose. Russia, meanwhile, has increasingly offered security partnerships, including through entities like the Wagner Group, providing military training and support to governments facing internal conflicts. For African nations, these competing offers create options that didn't exist during the Cold War, when countries often had to align clearly with either the Western or Soviet bloc. General Langley's comments reveal American concerns about losing influence in the region. When he questioned whether Burkina Faso's partnerships truly benefit its citizens, he was expressing a common Western view that Russian and Chinese involvement in Africa serves those countries' strategic interests rather than African development needs. But from Burkina Faso's perspective, these comments seemed hypocritical. After all, doesn't every nation form partnerships based on its own interests? Didn't Western nations engage with Africa primarily to advance their own strategic and economic goals? The underlying question becomes, who gets to decide what's best for Burkina Faso? Should it be General Langley and AFRI-COM? Or should it be the Burkinabe government and its citizens? Before delving deeper into the geopolitical tensions, let's look at what Burkina Faso is actually doing domestically that makes its independent stance so significant. The tomato industry provides a perfect example. Burkina Faso has historically been a major tomato producer, but there was a frustrating pattern. The country would grow tomatoes, ship them to France for processing and packaging, then buy them back at higher prices. This arrangement benefited the French economy while keeping Burkina Faso in an economically subordinate position. Raw materials would leave the country, and value-added products would return at premium prices, a classic colonial economic relationship persisting long after formal independence. Under new leadership, Burkina Faso has invested in building its own tomato processing plants. Now, instead of shipping raw tomatoes abroad, the country can process them domestically, create local jobs, and capture more of the economic value. This is just one example of a broader push toward economic self-sufficiency. Similar efforts are happening across multiple sectors. In agriculture, the government has invested in modern farming equipment like tractors to boost productivity and food security. In education, new schools and universities are being constructed, along with laboratory facilities, so students no longer need to travel to neighbouring countries for scientific research. In healthcare, hospital construction has been prioritised to make medical services more accessible to the general population. These developments represent a fundamental shift in approach, from accepting dependency to building capacity, from exporting problems to solving them domestically, from being a source of raw materials to creating finished products. And remarkably, much of this is happening without the massive foreign aid packages that many developing nations rely on. Instead, innovative approaches like the Salary Contribution Fund mentioned earlier are helping finance these initiatives. This context helps explain why Burkina Faso was so offended by General Langley's suggestion that its current partnerships aren't serving its people. From the Burkinabe perspective, they're seeing more tangible progress than they did during decades of Western-aligned policies. Beyond economic development, Burkina Faso faces serious security challenges. The country has been battling extremist groups linked to Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, particularly in its northern regions bordering Mali and Niger. Here too, Burkina Faso has chosen an approach that emphasizes self-reliance over foreign intervention. After years of French military presence failed to resolve the security crisis, the country developed a different strategy. One innovative element is the Volunteers for the Defense of the Homeland VDP program. Rather than waiting for distant army units to respond to attacks, local communities are trained to defend themselves. Young people from villages and towns receive basic military training and weapons, allowing them to serve as a first line of defense against terrorist incursions. Think of it like a neighborhood watch program, but with much higher stakes. While professional military forces might arrive too late to prevent attacks, local defenders already live in the threatened communities and can respond immediately. This approach represents a fundamentally different security philosophy than the one Western powers typically advocate. Instead of centralizing security in professional forces, often supported by foreign advisors and equipment, it distributes defensive capabilities throughout society. The VDP program has shown promising results in some areas, though security challenges remain significant. What's important is that it represents a Burkinabe solution to Burkinabe problems, developed locally rather than imported from abroad. This security approach, combined with the economic initiatives described earlier, reflects a comprehensive vision of national development and sovereignty. It's a vision that prioritizes self-sufficiency, local solutions, and breaking dependency relationships. But can this approach succeed in the long run? Can a relatively small, landlocked nation like Burkina Faso truly chart an independent course when powerful global players disapprove? To better understand Burkina Faso's approach, it's helpful to contrast it with different responses to similar challenges. The original text mentions the Democratic Republic of Congo as a counterexample. The DRC is an enormous country, rich in natural resources like gold, diamonds, cobalt, and coltan. Yet parts of its territory, particularly in the eastern regions around Goma, have experienced decades of violence and instability. According to the comparison made in the original text, there's a striking contrast between how these two countries respond to crisis. In Burkina Faso, there's a nationwide mobilization to address security threats, with citizens actively participating in defense efforts through programs like the VDPS. In the DRC, the text suggests there's a disconnect between the peaceful areas of the country, like the capital Kinshasa, and conflict zones like Goma. While violence ravages eastern provinces, life in the capital continues with concerts and celebrations, creating a sense that the war is someone else's problem. This comparison highlights different national responses to adversity. In one case, there's collective responsibility and sacrifice. In the other, compartmentalization and distance. The contrast isn't meant to criticize Congolese people, but to illustrate different approaches to national challenges. It raises important questions about unity, collective responsibility, and how societies respond to crises affecting some but not all of their citizens. For Burkina Faso, the emphasis on collective sacrifice and participation, from the president refusing his salary to citizens joining defense volunteers, forms a core part of its self-reliance philosophy. This unity of purpose helps explain why foreign criticism feels particularly unjustified to many Burkinabe. When General Langley suggested that the country's leadership isn't acting in citizens' best interests, he wasn't just questioning specific policies. He was challenging a national project that many citizens have personally invested in and sacrificed for. In response to General Langley's comments, Burkina Faso's government didn't just express disagreement, it made specific requests about how international relations should function. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs statement called for mutual respect in international relations. It urged partners, including the United States, to engage through proper diplomatic channels rather than making public criticisms in forums like Senate hearings. This call for respect is about more than hurt feelings. It reflects a fundamental principle in international law: sovereign equality among nations. This principle holds that despite differences in size, wealth, or military power, all nations deserve equal respect for their independence and right to self-determination. When smaller nations like Burkina Faso assert this principle against global powers, they're not just being sensitive, they're demanding adherence to the rules-based international order that powerful countries themselves claim to uphold. The government specifically highlighted that diplomatic concerns should be raised through appropriate channels, direct government-to-government communications, rather than public statements that can be perceived as attempts to undermine the country's leadership. By framing the issue this way, Burkina Faso elevated the dispute from a disagreement about specific partnerships to a principled stance about how international relations should function. It positioned itself not as a recipient of American guidance, but as an equal participant in the international community, entitled to make its own choices without public criticism from other nations. This stance resonates with many people across Africa and other formerly colonized regions, who see parallels between today's power dynamics and historical patterns of Western intervention and control. One particularly contentious aspect of General Langley's comments involved allegations of corruption. During the Senate hearing, he suggested that Burkina Faso's leadership might be receiving personal benefits from foreign partners in exchange for access to resources like gold. Whether it's their gold reserves, all those proceeds are just in exchange to protect the junta regime, Langley claimed, implying that the country's partnerships with Russia and China were more about enriching and protecting its leadership than benefiting ordinary citizens. These allegations strike at the heart of Burkina Faso's sovereignty narrative, while President Traore has portrayed his government as fighting against exploitation and working toward national self-sufficiency. Langley's comments paint a different picture, one where the leadership has simply switched foreign patrons rather than achieved true independence. From Burkina Faso's perspective, such allegations are particularly galling when coming from Western powers that have historically benefited from resource extraction in Africa. Many African nations have seen their natural resources exploited by Western corporations for decades, often with minimal benefits flowing to local populations. The corruption allegations also illustrate how difficult it is for African nations to pursue independent policies without having their motives questioned. When African countries partner with Western nations, it's framed as embracing democracy and development. When they partner with Russia or China, it's portrayed as corruption or misguided leadership. This double standard frustrates many African leaders and citizens who see themselves as making pragmatic choices based on their national interests, just as Western nations do. The exchange highlights fundamentally different narratives about what's happening in Burkina Faso and similar countries. Is this a story of corrupt leaders selling out to new foreign powers? Or is it a story of a nation asserting its right to choose its own partnerships without Western approval? The truth likely contains elements of both perspectives. No government is perfect, and any international partnership involves complex calculations of national interest. But the question remains, who gets to judge these choices? Burkina Faso's diplomatic spat with the United States isn't happening in isolation. Similar tensions have emerged across several West African nations, including Mali and Niger, which have also expelled Western forces and pivoted toward Russia. This regional trend suggests deeper forces at work beyond the decisions of individual leaders. Many of these countries face similar challenges: persistent security threats from extremist groups, continued economic dependency on former colonial powers, and frustration with Western partnerships that haven't delivered the promised results. The shift also reflects changing global power dynamics. As China's economic influence grows and Russia asserts itself militarily, African nations have more options for international partnerships than they did a generation ago. For decades after independence, most African countries had limited choices in international relations. Western powers dominated global institutions like the World Bank and International Monetary Fund, controlled access to capital markets, and maintained significant military presence across the continent. Today, China offers massive infrastructure investments through its Belt and Road Initiative. Russia provides security cooperation without the political conditions Western nations impose. These alternatives give African governments leverage they didn't previously have. When Burkina Faso, Mali, or Niger can credibly threaten to switch partners if Western countries push too hard on certain issues, it fundamentally changes the power dynamics in those relationships. This context explains why General Langley's comments provoked such a strong response. They weren't just about Burkina Faso, they represented a Western attempt to discredit a broader movement toward greater African choice in international partnerships. The tension between global powers and nations seeking greater independence raises profound questions about how international relations should function in the 21st century. Should smaller nations be free to choose any partnerships they want, or should powerful countries have a say in these choices, especially when they believe certain partnerships might undermine global stability? What's often missing from international discussions about countries like Burkina Faso is the perspective of ordinary citizens. How do everyday Burkinabe people feel about their government's shift away from Western partnerships toward Russia and China? While definitive polling data might be limited, certain patterns emerge from reports and social media. Many citizens, particularly younger Burkinabe, express frustration with decades of French influence that didn't seem to improve their lives or security. They welcome assertions of national sovereignty and applaud leaders who stand up to former colonial powers. The symbolic actions of Traoré's government, refusing presidential salaries, building national industries, mobilizing citizens for defense, resonate with a population. Public rallies supporting the government's stance against Western criticism have drawn substantial crowds in Burkina Faso's capital, Ouagadougou. These demonstrations suggest that whatever outsiders might think about the government's choices, they enjoy significant domestic support. This popular backing is crucial because it challenges Western narratives about what's happening in countries like Burkina Faso that many Burkina-based citizens would strongly dispute. Of course, support isn't universal. Some citizens worry about isolation from Western partners or have concerns about specific policies. This reality creates a dilemma for Western powers. If they push too hard against governments that enjoy popular support, they risk alienating entire populations, not just their leaders. But if they accept partnerships they view as problematic, it doesn't just mean governments making independent choices. It means populations determining their own futures without external interference. While international tensions capture headlines, Burkina Faso's government emphasizes its domestic achievements. The Foreign Ministry's response to General Langley highlighted improvements in key sectors like agriculture, education, healthcare, and security. In agriculture, the government has invested in mechanization and processing facilities, like the tomato plants mentioned earlier. These investments aim to increase food production and capture more value within the country rather than exporting raw materials. The education system has seen expansion with new schools, universities, and laboratory facilities. One specific improvement mentioned is the creation of microscope laboratories within the country, eliminating the need for students to travel abroad for certain types of scientific research. Healthcare has been another priority, with new hospitals being constructed to improve access for the general population. These facilities aim to reduce dependency on foreign medical systems and bring care closer to communities that previously had limited access. These concrete developments provide context for understanding why the government and many citizens reject the notion that their current partnerships aren't working. From their perspective, they're seeing more tangible progress than they did during years of Western-dominated relationships. Of course, significant challenges remain. Burkina Faso continues to rank low on human development indices, and the security situation remains precarious in many regions. No policy approach can transform deeply rooted challenges overnight. But the government's narrative is one of momentum and direction, moving purposefully toward greater self-sufficiency and development, despite obstacles and outside criticism. This narrative powerfully counters General Langley's suggestions that the country's current partnerships harm its citizens' interests. If these partnerships are supporting improvements in agriculture, education, healthcare, and security, how can they be characterized as harmful? At the heart of this diplomatic tension lies a fundamental question. Should any nation have the right to tell another which partners to choose? When General Langley suggested that Burkina Faso's partnerships with Russia and China harm its citizens, he was making a value judgment about what relationships serve the country best. This approach reflects a common Western perspective that views certain international relationships as inherently better or worse than others. Burkina Faso's government forcefully rejected this framework. Their response essentially asked, by what authority does the United States presume to evaluate our partnerships? Just as individuals choose their own friends, shouldn't sovereign nations select their own allies based on their assessment of national interest? This question becomes even more pointed given historical context. Western powers, including the United States, have supported authoritarian regimes when it served their strategic interests. During the Cold War, America allied with dictatorships across Africa, Asia, and Latin America to counter Soviet influence, often with devastating consequences for local populations. Given this history, claims about which partnerships benefit the people can seem hypocritical when coming from Western officials. The implication is that partnerships should be evaluated not on whether they advance Western interests, but on whether they genuinely improve life for ordinary citizens. This debate reflects competing visions of international order. Should the world operate as a hierarchy where powerful nations influence the choices of others, or should it function as a community of equals where even small nations make independent decisions without interference? For Burkina Faso and many similar countries, the answer is clear. True sovereignty means choosing your own path, even when, perhaps especially when, global powers disapprove. The diplomatic tension between Burkina Faso and the United States represents more than just a bilateral disagreement. It illustrates broader questions about Africa's place in the global order and the continent's pursuit of genuine independence. For decades, African nations have struggled to escape patterns established during the colonial era. Political independence didn't automatically translate to economic self-determination or true sovereignty in international relations. Former colonial powers maintained significant influence through economic ties, military agreements, and control of international institutions. The actions of countries like Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger represent an attempt to break these patterns, to assert greater agency in determining their own futures. Whether these specific approaches will succeed remains to be seen, but they reflect a growing determination across the continent to chart independent courses. This assertion of agency challenges powerful international actors to reconsider how they engage with African nations. Rather than prescribing policies or partnerships, perhaps the most constructive approach is supporting African-led solutions to African challenges. The tension also highlights the changing nature of global influence. Hard power, military force, and even traditional economic power may be less effective than genuine partnership and respect. Nations that acknowledge African agency and treat the continent's countries as true equals may ultimately build more sustainable relationships than those that attempt to direct or control them. As the global order continues to evolve, with traditional Western dominance increasingly challenged by rising powers, Africa's position becomes more significant. The continent's 54 nations represent a substantial voting bloc in international institutions and control valuable resources and markets. How African nations choose to navigate this changing landscape will have profound implications not just for their own development, but for the future shape of global politics. Will they align with traditional Western partners, pivot toward emerging powers like China and Russia, or forge truly independent paths? The case of Burkina Faso suggests that many African nations are no longer content to simply follow paths prescribed by former colonial powers or global hegemons. They demand the right to make their own choices, even when those choices challenge Western preferences. This shift fundamentally alters global dynamics. When smaller nations successfully assert independence against powerful international actors, they demonstrate that sovereignty isn't just a legal concept, but a practical reality. As this drama continues to unfold across Africa, the ultimate question remains: can nations like Burkina Faso truly forge independent paths in a world still dominated by great power competition, or will they simply exchange one form of dependency for another? The answer may determine not just the future of individual African nations, but the nature of global politics in the coming decades. Will we move toward a world of genuine sovereign equality, or will power imbalances continue to shape international relations in ways that limit the choices of smaller nations? Burkina Faso's standoff with the United States offers no definitive answers to these questions, but it powerfully illustrates the tensions at the heart of today's international system and the determination of formerly colonized nations to claim their rightful place as genuinely independent actors on the world stage. As President Ibrahim Traoré and his government continue their experiment in self-reliance and sovereign choice, the world watches, some with hope, others with skepticism, but all recognizing that something significant is happening in this landlocked West African nation, something that may have implications far beyond its borders. This isn't just a story about Traore or Trump, it's about all of us, about remembering who we are, protecting African unity and solidarity, and rebuilding what was broken during colonialism while fighting neocolonialism. And if you felt anything watching this, pride, curiosity, maybe even a little fire in your chest, then don't let that feeling disappear. Subscribe to The New Tourist right now, because this isn't the last story like this we're telling. Not by a long shot. Like this video so the algorithms don't bury a story the world needs to hear. Share it with your family, your friends, and your group chats. Be the reason someone else learns the truth. And if you want to go even deeper, if you want behind-the-scenes stories, early access, exclusive discussions, join our membership community. Because The New Tourist isn't just a channel anymore, it's a movement. And the story we're writing together is only just beginning.